This is Hong Kong International Airport. Last year, it moved 5 million tons of freight and 61 million passengers, making it the busiest cargo airport on the planet. And this is Frankfurt Airport, the busiest cargo airport in Europe, which also carried about 65 million passengers of its own. But if I asked you which airport is the busiest for cargo in the United States, what would you guess? Most people would say Memphis, the home of FedEx Superhub, or maybe Louisville, the home of UPS. But you'd be wrong. America's busiest airport isn't a major city at all, but it sits in a remote, frozen corner of the world with no manufacturing base, no industry, and not even a real population to speak of. And yet, as of 2026, it handles more cargo than any other airport in the United States and the entire North America. Everything from your phone, your clothes, and even the package sitting on your doorstep right now, there's a real chance it passed through this exact airport, long before it ever reached your city. In fact, roughly 80% of all air cargo crossing the Pacific stops here first. Not Los Angeles, not Tokyo, but here. So why do the world's largest cargo carriers choose to land here? And how did an airport in one of the emptiest parts of North America become the most important stop in global air freight? This is the story of Anchorage Airport and the strange economics that keep the world's freighters landing in Alaska. To understand how we got here, let's go a little back in history, because for most of human history, Alaska was considered almost completely worthless. You see, until 1867, Alaska was still a colony of the Russian Empire, ruled by Emperor Alexander II. But at the time, Russia was facing severe financial deficits following the Crimean War, and ironically, still is. On top of that, the Russians feared losing the territory to Great Britain in a future conflict without receiving any compensation. So in 1867, Alexander II decides to sell Alaska to America for just $7.2 million, which works out to only around $111 million when adjusted for inflation today. Because in his mind, he was offloading a frozen wasteland. But that assessment would prove wrong when gold was discovered in Alaska just 2 decades later, in the late 1890s. Miners extracted hundreds of millions of dollars in gold, quickly paying back the original $7.2 million purchase price many times over. But even with the gold rush bringing economic opportunity and new infrastructure, Alaska's population was still only a little more than 200,000 people, in a state that was larger than Texas, California, and Montana all combined. And until the 20th century, Anchorage in Alaska would still be considered a far-flung and remote part of the world, seemingly far away and isolated from the rest of civilization. But everything changed with the arrival of the aviation boom, globalization, and, most importantly, with the rise of the Cold War. Now, you might be wondering what the Cold War has to do with any of this. You see, for most of the mid and late 20th century, if you wanted to fly from a European city like Rome to somewhere in East Asia like Tokyo, the fastest route by far was straight over Siberia. But since Siberia belonged to the Soviet Union, the Soviets had shut their airspace to nearly every Western airline. This meant that Western airlines were effectively blocked from flying over this continent-sized stretch of the planet, right in the middle of the 2 regions they most wanted to connect. So they had to find another way to link Europe and East Asia. This is where Anchorage comes into the picture. So with the most efficient route off the table, the next best option was to fly north from Europe, up and over the pole, around the edge of Soviet airspace, and then back down toward Japan. But the problem was that no aircraft of that era had the range to complete a flight that long on a single tank of fuel. A refueling stop had to be placed somewhere along the way, and the only city of any real size anywhere near that route was, of course, Anchorage. The result was not surprising. Within the span of a decade, Anchorage went from being one of the most isolated places on Earth to handling international air traffic that rivaled the likes of Chicago and even Los Angeles. Flights came in from places as far apart as Paris, London, Sao Paulo, Mumbai, and Seoul. You name it, and there was probably a flight from there. And with all of that traffic came money. Every one of those aircraft needed fuel, ground handling, and crew hotels. And Anchorage was the only place for thousands of kilometers that could provide any of it. A city that most of the world had never heard of had quietly become one of the most important stopovers in global aviation. In fact, it earned itself a nickname, the Crossroads of the World. But this would not last forever. As the Cold War wound down toward the end of the 1980s, the Soviets finally reopened their airspace to the West. And just like that, the whole reason for stopping in Anchorage began to vanish. To make matters worse, this was also the era when long-range aircraft like the 777 were being developed. Machines that could fly the entire distance between Europe and Asia in a single go. The collapse was quick and brutal. By 1991, Japan Airlines had cut its Anchorage service from as many as 117 flights a week down to just a handful, and it would eventually pull out completely. One by one, the others followed. Lufthansa, Air France, and British Airways all withdrew their passenger flights from Alaska for good. By all logic, that should have been the end of the story. A brief golden age killed off by geopolitics and better airplanes. And yet, despite all this, the Anchorage airport remains one of the busiest airports in the entire United States. In fact, as of 2026, Ted Stevens is ranked the #1 cargo airport in the United States. So, how did Anchorage pull this off? Well, you see, Anchorage might lack a large population or any major industrial production, but it has one massive advantage that no other city in the world can match: its location. When you take a map and try to locate Anchorage, it might seem to you that it's tucked into a remote corner of the world, but in reality, it's practically the center of it. In fact, the entirety of the U.S., Japan, South Korea, and most of China and Europe are all within reach of just a 9.5-hour flight. And no other major airport on the entire planet is within such close range of this many major cities across the industrialized world. And it is precisely because of this location that cargo carriers continue using Anchorage as a stopover point. Since Asia manufactures an enormous share of what American consumers buy, everything from electronics to clothing, a steady stream of cargo jets makes a stop here every single day. In fact, 80% of all cargo flights operating across the Pacific make a technical stop at Anchorage, which includes refueling, a crew change, and transfer of cargo onto other planes. But here's the thing. Why would a plane bother stopping in some remote place when it could just fly straight to its destination? Well, this is exactly where things shift in Anchorage's favor. You see, when you're running a cargo operation, you really only have two options. You can either carry more fuel and less cargo, which extends your range and lets you fly direct, or you can carry more cargo and less fuel, which means you'll need a stopover along the way. But there is a problem with option 1, and let me explain it to you with an example. Here's the fuel burn chart for the Boeing 777 freighter, which shows the lowest fuel burn per minute of flying is achieved approximately between 2,200 and 2,700 nautical miles. But as you can see, as the distance increases, the fuel consumption suddenly spikes by a huge margin. Which means if an aircraft decides to go direct, it will not only carry less cargo, but will also burn more fuel. And the only thing that it would be saving is maybe an hour or two. The second option, however, is a different story. By stopping to refuel, a carrier can haul an extra 100,000 pounds of cargo into North America on every single flight. Now do the math. At a minimum $1 of revenue per extra pound, 5 flights a day, 6 days a week, 52 weeks a year. That comes out to more than $150 million in added revenue for a single carrier. And I'm still being conservative here. because as the revenue per pound climbs, the whole equation flips even harder in favor of a stopover. But extra revenue isn't the only reason airlines stop in Anchorage. There's a regulatory advantage at play, too. You see, under U.S. Department of Transportation rules, foreign airlines are normally prohibited from moving cargo between two U.S. ports, or from transferring cargo between different flights on American soil. The restriction exists to protect U.S. companies from foreign carriers that can operate at far lower cost, whether through cheaper labor, weaker environmental standards, or generous government subsidies back home. But Anchorage is the exception. Given how much the airport meant to Alaska's economic development, authorities eased those restrictions in 2004, allowing cargo arriving from a foreign country to be transferred on Alaskan soil. And that single change made Anchorage remarkably flexible. Now, carriers could take the same time already spent refueling and use it to shuffle freight between their own planes or hand it off to some other carriers. And these rights come in a few different forms. There is the online transfer, where a carrier moves freight between its own aircraft. There is the interline transfer, where one carrier hands cargo off to a completely different airline. And then there's the change of gauge, the most useful of the three. That's where freight comes in on a single wide-body freighter and gets split across several smaller aircraft, each one bound for a different destination out of Anchorage. That single change reshaped Anchorage entirely. It's estimated that around 1 in 10 jobs in the Anchorage area traces back in some way to business generated at the airport. Some of it is direct, the crews and cargo handlers working the ramp. But a lot of it is indirect. The manufacturers, the freight forwarders, the local packaging and logistics firms that all exist because the airport does. And in the last few years, those jobs have only multiplied as cargo volumes through Anchorage climbed higher and higher. A big part of that surge came down to one thing: the explosion of trade between China and America. You see, in the years following the COVID-19 pandemic, e-commerce platforms like Shein and Temu grew at a staggering pace and became household names across the US. And they didn't operate like traditional retailers. Instead of shipping goods in bulk to warehouses by sea, they built their entire model around air freight, flying hundreds of thousands of individual parcels every single day straight from Chinese factories to American doorsteps. At its peak, Shein and Temu together were shipping enough to fill dozens of Boeing 777 freighters a day. And a huge share of that flood of light, high-value packages crossed the Pacific along the very route that runs straight through Anchorage. But Anchorage isn't planning to stay as a simple pit stop. In recent years, the airport has been pushing to become something more, shifting from a place where cargo merely passes through into a place where it's stored, sorted, and put together. And that ambition is now taking physical shape on the ground. The centerpiece is a $75 million climate-controlled complex built specifically for temperature-sensitive cargo such as pharmaceuticals, fresh Alaskan seafood, and other perishables that can't just sit on a cold ramp waiting for a connection. For the first time, goods like these can be held, processed, and staged right at the airport instead of being trucked thousands of miles to cold storage in the lower 48. Alongside it, a separate facility is being built as a shared cargo terminal, a space where several airlines can swap, store, and process freight under one roof. And that fills a real gap. Most carriers here don't have their own buildings the way FedEx and UPS do, so they've had little choice but to work off the ramp. A shared terminal changes that. Now they can move freight between planes without the whole operation stalling while they wait on a connecting flight. So, the next time you see a package arrive at your door faster than you thought it would, there's a good chance it passed through a city you've never thought about. And as long as Asia builds and America buys, this quiet city will keep sitting right in the middle of everything.